Hello, everyone. I am Umu with Mind Wellness Lounge. Please help me welcome Mawule Sevon, who is a board certified school psychologist as well as a nationally board certified behavioral analyst. She is also the founder of the Key Consulting Firm, which has a mission to try to reduce racial inequalities in the educational system. Thank you. Today I have Mawule Sevon. She is a school psychologist. A lot of the times, a lot of us parents do not even know we have school psychologists available to our service or resource in the school. The reason for me having to bring her is because at the end of the day, our kids, especially minority kids, they will start to have emotional issues related to anxiety or depression, or they'll have behavior issues. And sometimes it's not ADHD, it's maybe more anxiety also. But what will happen is you as a parent, you will get letters and letters and call anxious, and then the child have school avoidance, and it's a cycle. However, usually once your child start having these problems and the teacher is calling you, we have school counselors that are available. We have school psychologists that are available. But unless you know how to find these information, it's not readily there for you to know. So me bringing Miss Sevon here is to kind of her to educate me, educate you guys, provide resources so you can know how to seek out a school psychologist because they are wonderful. They are there to support the school and support the kids. Thank you for joining me today. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me.
You are welcome. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So my name is Mawule Sevon. I am a school psychologist. I'm also a board certified behavior analyst. So I'll talk about what that means a little bit later.
Okay.
But most of my work is around addressing inequities within schools and how we serve children who are culturally diverse. So that's really what I focus on. Currently, I serve as the executive director of the Key Consulting Firm, which focuses on making sure that Black children thrive in school.
Okay. I'm going to make sure I actually put in more information about her consulting firm and information in general, how to contact her. So in case you have more questions, we can kind of hopefully have her be able to kind of help you navigate some of this. I'm going to also, we're going to talk about what are the roles and functions of a school psychologist. For somebody who would not have even know about who a school psychologist is, can you tell me more?
Sure. A lot of people actually don't know what a school psychologist is. I don't think my mom even knows. I've been doing this for a while. So typically a school psychologist is a mental health clinician that works in schools. A big part of our job is those psychoeducational evaluations where we do testing, which includes cognitive assessment and most often social emotional assessment based on the child.
Okay.
We usually are doing these assessments to determine if a child is eligible for special education services.
Okay.
We can also serve the function of a therapist within school doing psychotherapy with children.
Mm-hmm.
And then we can also do a lot of consulting with schools on addressing either a learning challenge or behavioral challenge.
A lot of the times, and thank you very much for explaining that, a lot of the times when we talk about special education, a lot of parents get almost like a stigma. Okay, my child does not have any intellectual disability, my child is functional, my child is smart. Wonderful. But you have to understand special education just means accommodating the child to be able to perform and function within the school setting. So special education is just a word that's being used, but keep in mind it's a wonderful word. If you can just perceive it as a wonderful word, it means what can the school do to accommodate your child that might be having difficulties with sensory issues, difficulties with anxiety, a crowding class, a very bright light. What can be done to make sure the child is put in a situation or a setting that allows them to perform at their best? So I have more questions for you. What are some of the ways, and I know you already tapped on some of these things in terms of the student aspect, but I think another bigger factor for you guys is support for the faculty. Just at dealing with so many behaviors in the class, what are some of the ways you guys support your faculties in the school?
Yeah, so typically our goal within school psychology and special education as a whole is to really make sure that we're providing as much interventions as possible so that a child doesn't need a IEP if not needed or a Section 504 plan. And so a lot of our work is around consulting with the school, the teachers, the principals, whoever's in the educational team, whether they're instructional or not, on how to address the needs of that child, which is why I went back to school and became a certified behavior analyst, because there's a lot of data around how children are treated when they display concerning behaviors in school. And a lot of it's not effective, and it increases the likelihood of this school to prison pipeline. And so a lot of my work is around teaching teachers how to nurture the strengths and the gifts of this child while also diminishing the problem behaviors that they have. Because usually when we look at problem behavior, it's sometimes a skill deficit. The skill is missing. How can we teach them a new skill, which is a replacing behavior, to get rid of the behavior we don't want? And so a lot of our work is training teachers, training educators, so they can shift their mind and kind of look at the problem in a different way, so they're able to support that child behaviorally.
I'm going to actually put you back to kind of go more on the behavior analyst section. You mentioned a topic that a lot of minorities we know, which is school to pipeline. And the theory behind the school to pipeline, if you do not know, when we keep saying going into elementary school or just school in general to pipeline, is the fact that a lot of kids of minority, a lot of kids in general, when they have anxiety, their behaviors are actually disruptive. But what happens is the minute this behavior starts to happen, instead of the root cause being assessed, the child is almost being in a punished aspect where it's a continual information about you are this, and the labeling starts, and almost like the focus becomes what the behavior is versus what the internal triggers or external triggers are. So what happens is that child would actually have anxiety, but because they are being labeled or perceived as being disturbed, then you have them being in a situation where other kids are seeing them as being disruptive, teachers seeing them as being disruptive, and the child actually moves through the school with these labels, unaddressed, unhelped, and what happens is the child actually becomes what's considered a self-fulfilling prophecy. They gave me the label, I grow into the label, and I become, that's just one of the theories. There's more other aspects we're not talking about. So I'm gonna have her talk a little bit more about what a behavior analyst would do in terms of when we start to see kids that might actually fall into that criteria that says you start at school, by the time you get to a specific age, you're most likely going to be a juvenile or kicked out of school or in jail by the time things happen.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought this point, because it's very important. It's actually my mission in life is to address this problem. So research has shown that children as young as 3 years old are being impacted by the school to prison pipeline. And what is actually happening is that we're over punishing certain children. And currently the data shows that African American, Black students, Latinx students, and students who are Native American are overrepresented when we look at the discipline records within the schools. Starting at preschool all the way up. You're more likely to be suspended as a preschool student than a 12th grader, which is shocking because they're so little at 3 and so very big in 12th grade. And so my job is really to teach schools effective ways of disciplining children, because currently they are not using effective measures. Suspension, which is a big one, suspension and exclusion, which are different. Suspension is where you're removed from the entire school, but there's exclusionary actions, which include removing a kid from a classroom and saying go to another classroom, or putting them in ISS, which is in-school suspension, or telling them to go to the principal's office. That's exclusionary, but you're not technically suspended. So we put them on the same category when we look at the school to prison pipeline. But we found that when you exclude children, when you're suspending them, it's actually not very effective in decreasing the behavior that you don't want to see. And science has told us, and the field has showed us, when you want to see behavior go down, you must replace it. And so we need to focus on what's the replacement for whichever behavior. Like you mentioned, anxiety. You have a child who's anxious or is having some difficulties regulating mood, then you need to teach them the skills to regulate the mood, to regulate their anxiety, to display their anxiety and frustration in a way that's not as destructive and disruptive to the learning environment.
It's a wonderful thing you talked about. I'm going to use the personal analogy, and I know we're not supposed to be doing a lot of sharing, but I have to. And the reason I'm actually doing this platform is because a lot of the struggles I'm going through, which I wouldn't have considered going through, I'm going through them with my own son, and I've gone through them with my oldest son. But I'm in a position now to make sure that a lot of you guys get to understand it is a system that's built the way it is built, but unless you receive support or you know how to ask for the correct information and seek resources and align yourself with people who know what needs to be done, you are almost going to be in that spiraling where at the end of the day, your child becomes that statistics. So an example is my 7-year-old has anxiety at school. Initial first day of school, we already know he's anxious, but we were like, he'll be fine. He's going to blend in. Behavior starts to happen. He finishes his work fast. He has a conversation. Somebody talks to him. If the teacher asks for something, he says it out really fast. He goes out to want to help the teacher, and sometimes he raises the blackboard before she's done. Guess what? Now he's labeled as disruptive. Now he's labeled as he just does his work too fast and he doesn't 100% do it with quality. Then the behavior led to where they were actually taking him out of the class and sending him to a different class. But what they did not understand was, as much as they were now addressing the anxiety, now they were actually allowing him to be bullied. It's a cycle. He starts to kind of have that self-esteem issue. Why can't I do it right? Why is this happening to me? I'm always trying to be helpful, but I'm just not helpful at all because I end up being disruptive. But nobody's actually saying or giving him a replacement. But what happens is by them taking him out of class, they were building more anxiety in him, building more fear in him, building more insecurity in him. And it started to escalate. A school psychologist was the one that reached out to me and said, can we consult? And that's how I got the help to where my son was able to complete the school year and not having to feel so stressed out about the fact that school is going to happen next year and I'm not hearing I don't want to go hang.
Yeah, I love that example because it shows how useful school psychologists have been initially. And so typically how it's supposed to happen, but unfortunately with limitations with funding and school psychologists have large caseloads. They're seeing sometimes thousands of kids on their caseload as far as schools. But typically what we want is that a school psychologist comes in early on before the situation balloons, before he's being placed out of the classroom. Maybe in the beginning of the year, the teacher can say, I have this child, and while I'm teaching, he's erasing the board, or he's doing these things when we're supposed to be in instructional time. How can I support this child? And then the school psychologist will come up with a plan. And that's initially a plan that's created well before the IEP. And they consult with the teacher on how to support that student. So like you said, we can come up with some behavior plans, replacement behaviors so that he can have something else to do. He can read a book. And if he's going too fast, what can we do to teach him to slow down and be more mindful and careful with his work? So that's a great example of what school psychologists do that's outside of our typical role of testing.
Another thing I wanted to mention also is, would you say that most of the time the perception of teachers are wonderful? They're busy. They're dealing with so many different personalities.
Yeah.
But one thing I have noticed as a parent in general is kids, minority kids that tend to have behavior issues in school, there's a lot of reactivity to what the behavior is versus almost like a productivity to what do we do to reduce the behavior, or can we find out what is the behavior, where is the stressor, where is the trigger? And this might be a generalization, but however, when we talk about minority kids being suspended out of school, Black boys, Black girls, Hispanic kids, and Native Americans, they suffer this significantly than any culture. So then when we look back, is it because the reaction that is given initially when the child's behavior starts is more on reactivity versus let's kind of isolate and see what else can we do to help?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. There's a lot of research that has looked at implicit bias. So we know as people, whether teachers, clinicians, Joe Smo on the street, we have a lot of bias. We live in a nation that has a long history of oppression against cultural minorities or culturally different people of color, people of various disabilities, people of various gender expressions have all been discriminated against in this nation. So we're all walking with this lens of bias. And what research has shown is children who are Black, Latinx, Native American, there is bias that they will misbehave more likely. But the same thing goes for Asian students, there's bias against them that they are going to be high performing, that they have to be perfect. So bias is impacting all of our students in schools who are not fitting in the mold of the dominant cultural group in our country, which is white Americans. So research has shown, they did a study with very young children, actually, preschool, and they showed that when a teacher was told, okay, here's a group of students, let me know when someone misbehaves. They watched the Black children much more often than any other children when they looked at the eye scans. They also showed that there's an empathy deficit, they'll call it. It's a research out of Yale, and it looks at when you know information about a child, maybe they've had history with trauma, maybe they have a known disability, you still lack empathy and you still contribute whatever behavior you're seeing that is concerning as bad versus a skill deficit or in need of more support. So those are happening. And it's contributing to, yes, the school to prison pipeline, disproportionality within discipline actions, but also disproportionality within educational attainment and their access to the curriculum. So that's really impacting them as well.
I want you to talk a little bit more also about almost like, and I keep calling it a self-fulfilling theory, because it's really not the child's self-fulfilling theory. The child actually learns to mold to what's been labeled. I don't know the words for it, but let's talk about a child who all of a sudden is starting a lot of behavior dysregularity in school. And when interventions are not given correctly, how they learn to grow into what's been labeled.
Yeah.
If you can give me a little bit more insight into just that as a behavior analyst.
Yeah. So when I talked about when you're observing children, you see what you're looking for oftentimes. So if you are waiting for someone to misbehave and you're just looking at the Black children or Latinx children or Native American children, you will see problem behavior because kids are always doing something. They're not supposed to, especially when they're 3, 4, 5 years old. They'll find something to do. So then you're often picking that child. You're reprimanding them. You're removing them from the classroom. You're acting like a first grader. Maybe it's a fifth grade. You're acting like a first grader. Go to a first grade class. And then you're telling him what he is. You're telling her who she is. There's also research around how we view certain groups of children as bigger and older. So when their behavior is developmentally appropriate, we're seeing it as a problem because we assume they're a few years older.
Being older.
Yeah, and more dangerous. And so we've all experienced where someone is afraid of us, and our children can tell when you're afraid of them, when you don't like them, when you don't have a relationship with them, and that's going to impact their behavior. It's a huge part of education is a relationship. So there's all these components that really impact this child's feeling of themselves, perception of themselves, and who they are as a human being.
Thank you for actually giving me that wonderful insight.
Yeah.
So
I do want to add one more thing with our schools and how we design our curriculum, because oftentimes our curriculum isn't culturally relevant either. And so we have curriculum that really doesn't even include people of color usually in the narratives, in the stories. And so what does that mean to that child when they're not able to see themselves in their curriculum?
Representative of the curriculum.
Yeah.
We are expecting every person to fit into a box of learning standards when we actually know everybody has a different learning mode. Some people are able to sit still to learn. Some people will have music playing and still reading. Some people will do their math while actually with background noise. Some kids will bounce the whole time doing something that's productive, but we are actually expecting kids to spend 8 hours a day in a class setting. A lot of that is not productive, but I know it's a system. The question is, how do we try to have schools start to implement things that are a learning environment that's comfortable for the child to come into? And if your behaviors or your emotions are not conducive to that classroom learning, how do we try to accommodate them outside of that classroom learning?
Yeah, so it really is a requirement for schools to shift what's normal, because there's no such thing as normal. We're all very different. We all have different needs. And so there's a lot of push within school psychology, within education, for equity within schools, and also justice within schools. Every child needs something slightly different, but our schools should be really aiming to make sure that every child can get what they need in the general education setting. And so that may require differentiation of instruction, which basically means you provide an instruction, but you change it into different ways of providing it so that everyone can learn. Now, that takes a lot of skill and a lot of creativity. But if you think back to when you were a child, sometimes you learn an activity. So you learn about volcanoes, we read a book, maybe we watched a movie, maybe we made a volcano, maybe we went to the museum and saw lava rocks. That was teaching the same concept, but in different modes. And so as adults, we do this all the time. I have to study for a test. I usually write out the information. I'll listen to a podcast about the information, but maybe someone else, they don't do well with hearing. They have to read it, or maybe they have to actually act it out. So you see some people act out things they're studying. So as adults, we've learned what works best for us and we do it. But children don't have that ability yet. They don't have that insight yet. So we kind of have to teach items and the instruction in different ways so everyone can benefit. Now, if you have a child who maybe needs additional support, just creating a space where they can get that. So maybe if you have a child who's kind of anxious, they have a box of soothing items. So they can go to the box and pull out a fidget and just use it while he's paying attention. So he can listen, but he's fidgeting. And some children can do that very well. They can move their hands and still look at you.
And that's kind of wonderful. You actually are talking into one of the other aspects we're talking about. When a child or a teacher consults you, besides the basic anxiety or behavior issues, what are some of the things that you notice that the consultation includes in general in terms of why they feel the need of support from you at that point in time?
Yeah, so with behavior, usually it's either a known disability, or there's some trauma history, or there's just gaps within instructional style in the environment. And so kind of figuring out what it is. So when I go in, usually I'm observing the classroom, seeing if there are situations within the environment that's creating this system or this problem. So if I have to go in and do a behavior plan, sometimes I go in classrooms and everyone's misbehaving. So maybe this is more of a classroom-wide intervention that needs to take place versus the intervention for one particular child. Another example is if it's a child with disability, kind of teaching the teacher what that disability means. I've worked with children with autism for a very long time. What does autism look like for this particular child? Because it's different for everyone. And how can we support him in the classroom or in the classroom with their autism diagnosis? If it's a child with trauma, teaching the educators on trauma awareness and trauma-informed care for the classroom. It's pretty particular to what's really going on.
So what's going on? That is one evaluation. Special education evaluation. What are you guys looking at, talking about? What are you looking to see if the child has symptoms of? If you can give me more information about that.
Okay, this is a great question. So there are two programs, I want to say, that are there to support children with disabilities. There's Section 504 plan, which is a plan that's backed by ADA, American Disability Act, and it's any person with a disability deserves and has the right to have their accommodations in schools. Then there's the Special Education Act. And within special education, which is IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, if you have a disability and it's impacting your education, then you qualify for special education. So that's a huge component that oftentimes we forget about. There has to be impact on education. So as a school psychologist, what we usually do, we'll do an original or initial evaluation, which will include a cognitive assessment, which in layman's terms is the IQ test that has been standardized. There's IQ test, and then we'll do observation, we'll interview the parents and do a developmental history background. So most people hate that as a parent because that's when we get into the nitty gritty. We're asking how much does the child weigh? Are you and the father still married? Were you taking drugs? Is there lead exposure? Was there traumatic injury to the brain? We're just asking very personal questions.
But they're very relevant.
Every question is relevant. Exactly. And so I like to say that because people think I shape my questions on who I think they are. Oftentimes when I ask, is there any exposure to drugs, alcohol, or nicotine, cigarettes, people get offended like, oh, are you asking everyone else? I ask every single parent. Lead exposure, every single parent. You have to, because you can't assume who has this exposure, but it can be very helpful in understanding this child as we do the evaluation. So we have parent history, parent information. We have our cognitive assessment, and then depending on the school district and where we are, we may do an academic assessment, which is basically seeing what the child has learned and what skills they still have that are educational. Because with the cognitive, it's looking at how the brain works, but with the educational, it's looking at how much they've learned, how well they can do the math, how fast they can do it. Are they on grade level with the math? And then we'll, depending on the reason we're doing the evaluation, we may do a social emotional, which looks at is there anxiety, is there depression, what are some of the other concerns? Is the child often feeling sick or feeling ill? All of those things.
It's a wonderful topic she brings in. Before where in general to talk about, you started to mention some of these things with the limitations. She mentioned one psychologist to God knows how many number of kids. One psychologist has to balance between so many different schools in the school district. Let's talk about this.
Yes, that's the hugest issue within the field. So one, with school psychology, we have a shortage in the field. There are not enough school psychologists. There's also not enough school psychologists of color, and there's also not enough school psychologists who are bilingual, meaning when there's a child who speaks another language, they are not able to do the assessment in their native tongue, which is another big problem that we'll talk about at another time. In addition to those problems, now we have an issue where many schools are sharing school psychologists. So one school psychologist may have 4 schools. When I was studying, I had a school psychologist that I worked with, and she had 4 schools. And one of her schools was 30 miles from a different school. So she had days where she was at a particular school. And outside of that, she was not able to go be at that location. So what ended up happening is because we have to do these assessments are very lengthy, then we end up spending most of our time doing assessments. And unfortunately, we're not able to do as much time doing consultation. Whether they're private or charter schools, they actually do not have a psychologist on site. They don't have a school psychologist. So if they have to do an assessment of any sort, they will contract out.
I see.
And so your child may be attending a school doesn't actually have a school psychologist that you can actually meet with. Maybe you can meet with a school counselor or a social worker, and they may not even have that. I know some schools don't have that as well.
When they contract out, is that the cost that the school system actually takes on, or is that a cost that the parents have to take on? Do you know how that aspect works in general?
So private schools, I'm not very sure.
Okay.
But with charter schools, the school will pay for the contract out.
Okay.
But it's usually when they're hiring the school psychologist to do an evaluation.
Okay.
For consulting and so within school psychology, what we really like to focus on are response to intervention, which is really how we address the problem before we get to the IEP level or stage. And so with that, you really need someone there prior to the evaluation, because you're supposed to be doing these interventions before you even get to testing. And if you don't have one on site, it's really hard. So you may ask one and they'll say, we don't have a school psychologist. And so trying to figure out, maybe is that the best school for your child? If the resources and supports aren't there, or maybe seeing if there's someone else who has enough skills that can really still support in that situation.
So thank you so much, because I wouldn't have even asked that question. A lot of the times when selecting schools, we look at rateschools.com, what's the rating for the schools, and we kind of merge our kids into these schools. But most of the time, we're not going back to say, do they have these resources? With the alarming increase in mental wellness or mental health struggles, I have a feeling that we need to start paying attention to schools that have resources where you have the counselors that are readily available, psychologists that are readily available, or the resources to kind of help your child, because we're seeing an alarming increase of mental health in the school, outside of the school. It's a big problem.
It is a large problem, and the funding from the nation, federal funding, is not being put into supporting schools and making sure they have clinicians on site. And so based on the needs of your child, you have a child who is struggling emotionally, or is something happening in their life. So both my parents, they obviously both of them divorced. You can't have one parent divorced, but they both divorced when I was younger, and I went to a Catholic school. They didn't have any clinicians. And so, for example, that would be a great option where, okay, I have a child who's going through a divorce. Maybe I should make sure the school has a clinician. But my mom didn't think anything of mental health. So that wasn't even something that crossed her mind. She knew this Catholic school will educate my child. She will be.
That was the primary focus, education.
Yeah.
I say. And it's the same for every minority parent, education. You out there, what would you say in general for dealing with, there's a lot of stigma with minorities and cultural ethnic backgrounds with accessing things that have to do with mental wellness.
Yeah.
What would you say has been your exposure and advice as to how do parents who would be uncomfortable having to really have their kids evaluated because of the stigma associated?
Yeah, so both my parents are also immigrants. They immigrated from Togo, West Africa. And so I did see in my household a lot of the stigma around mental health was not something we ever talked about. I think my dad is still disappointed that I went to school for psychology. But that wasn't something we ever talked about. It wasn't a conversation, but it needs to be. Right now, we have a lot of children. I talk about African children in particular and Asian American children who are having high anxiety because of the pressures of being perfect and performing at high rates. Everyone wants an A. If it's a 98, where's the 2 points? If it's 100, there was no extra credit. So there's this pressure that's on our children, and they are having higher rates of anxiety and depression and all these other things. And then also how we view the disability. So when we work with families who are diverse and their child has a disability that's diagnosed and is developmental, it's often, sometimes they feel guilty and responsible. Maybe I did something, someone is punishing me, someone did something to me, I'm being punished for some other problem I did before. And there's some shame. I don't want anyone to know this has happened. And so we really, in our community, to normalize neurodiversity, which is a big push right now. Everyone's different. Everyone has a different strength. Everyone has a different weakness. And if we could focus more on the strengths and less on the weaknesses, while still addressing the weakness, then we could be a lot more happy in celebrating our children. And so kind of looking at, there's a difference now in how our children are living in the world and being able to be a safe person for them and acknowledging that there's a lot more pressures, there's a lot more things that are impacting them, there's a lot more things following them, and how can you be more supportive?
Because wellness is what we're looking for. That's the key word, the key goal.
And wellness looks different for everyone. And so depending on your cultural group, maybe the traditional talking therapy doesn't work for you with a particular style of therapy. You need to figure out what is going to work for you, what's going to work for your family, and then seek that opportunity out. I know a lot of people are doing more mindfulness, and so it doesn't require you to see anyone, but you can engage in mindfulness with yourself and with your children. Because if you're well, then your children can model what you're doing to be well. Or you do yoga. A lot of cultural groups have been doing yoga for decades, not decades, centuries. And maybe that's something that's going to be very helpful for you. Physical activity is really good with addressing anxiety, so being a more active family.
One more question for you. This was something you actually educated me about, because in my head I was thinking, psychologist. You were like, hold up. There's a difference between just the psychologist title. School psychologist is different from the private sector or clinical psychologist. Can you give us more information in terms of what a school psychologist would have done in a school setting that's different from what a psychologist in not so much a school or private sector would do?
Okay, that's a great question. So school psychologists have two tracks they can go down. One track which is the track I went down, was a specialist degree, which is a master's degree plus 30 or 36 more credits. It's almost like 2 master's degrees, more credits, and you become certified as a school psychologist through our national organization, and then you can get certified or licensed through the Department of Education. So you don't have a doctorate degree, so you're not a doctor, but you're a school psychologist. The other way, a school psychologist can get a doctorate degree in school psychology. But once you have a doctorate degree, you are eligible to become licensed if you have a doctorate in school psychology, clinical psychology, and I want to say counseling, but I'm not 100% sure. I think it's definitely counseling psychology. So if you go down those 3 routes with the doctorate degree, you are eligible for licensure depending on your state, within your state. Once you're licensed with the doctorate degree and one of those 3 degrees, you are able to call yourself a psychologist. And you're technically a licensed psychologist. So those are 2 things. Your school psychologist specialist degree. You can become a school psychologist that has a PhD or PsyD, and then you could also be a licensed psychologist. So that's 2 levels there. Then there's the additional clinical psychologist, which is what most people think of. These individuals have a doctorate degree in clinical psychology and have been licensed. And then they're able to still call themselves a psychologist.
When it comes to the diagnosis, when you guys do your evaluation, are you guys able to put in diagnosis, or are you guys only, what's the restriction in general for you guys diagnosing in school versus a clinical psychologist diagnosing outside of school?
Okay, that's a great question. In school, we have to remember that the diagnoses that are provided are actually not diagnosed. In school, we give categorization. Within special education, there's 13 categories. And a school psychologist will do an assessment and determine which category, which of the 13 you fit on based on the criteria that's outlined by the state or the school district. And those are public information. If you want to see what's, for example, the criteria for intellectually disabled, you can just look it up on your school's your school district's website, or you can look at the national website, which is IDEA.org, I think. Or .gov, one of them. I can email it to you and put it in the show notes if you like, but that way you can see the national criteria for each of those categories. With a psychologist, whether a licensed psychologist, whether they have their degree in school psych, clinical, or counseling, they will give a diagnosis from the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. And that is how you get the diagnosis that follows you throughout life, because the categorization that you receive from the school psychologist as a part of special education doesn't follow you past 12th grade.
Okay. Anything I'm missing before we close this video?
No, I think you asked a really good question, and this is a great resource for parents because it's a lot of information that isn't readily accessible.
And keep in mind, this is just a tip of what is really out there. So I will be bringing in the future, most likely invite these guys back, or Mr. Sevon to come back, because there's other aspects in general about neurodiversity or diversity in terms of education, access, and resources in school that we need to talk about. Again, thank you for watching.